hopefully have that. So again, thank you everybody for participating in Friends of Shades Creek Thursday night educational program. Couple of announcements. Just want to let you know Friends of Shades Creek participated in a stream cleanup in Irondale, Alabama. We coordinated and collaborated with the city of Irondale, the Cahaba River Society, um, Alabama Pals, and Goodwin Mills and Kaywood. We had 25 participants out for just a few short hours and collected over 400 pounds of trash out of a reach in Irondale. And so that was a lot of fun. It's the first time we'd had a cleanup in that section of the water, or the stream. Water was very low, made it easy for walking, and it will be a return trip for us in the future. It was pretty successful. So we appreciate that. Announcements coming up this weekend, Saturday, starting at 8:30. Friends of Shades Creek, along with the Homewood Environmental Commission, Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and Samford University will be planting trees along Shades Creek. We're going to be meeting at the soccer fields next to the Greenway in Homewood. Henry's going to go into a little more detail about that opportunity, but just want to let everybody know that everyone, young and old, is welcome. We have trees to plant and need lots of folks willing to dig small holes and put some cool trees in the ground. Reminder also coming up the last Saturday in January of 2023 is the Salamander Festival. This year it's going to be held at Homewood High School. And so just to put on your calendars, January 28th is the Salamander Festival. If there are no significant announcements or anything from the group, I will welcome our speaker tonight, who's Henry Hughes. Henry has over 25 years of experience as a forestry professional here in Alabama. He's retired as the Director of Education from the Birmingham Botanical Gardens. He has led the Centennial Tree planting program. Thousands of locally sourced native trees have been grown from seeds that have been collected and planted back along Shades Creek and in Birmingham and the surrounding area. So it's an awesome project that has been going on for, close to 15 years. Henry's got degrees in forestry from the University of South Sewanee, additional degrees in botany and soil science from the University of Kentucky and Texas A&M. He's going to be speaking to us about the forest trees of the Shades Creek watershed, and I just wanted to hand this off to Henry. I'm going to put us on to the small active speaker portion, and I encourage you to do that so you get to see Henry talking. And Henry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody for showing up in intimidating numbers tonight. This was a class that Michelle and I did 4 times for the Audubon, Birmingham Audubon, no, Alabama Audubon now. And I've made it an abbreviated class for tonight. For it was 6 1.5-hour classes. So we're going to do a really brief summary of the class. We're thinking of doing this again for Friends of Shades Creek this time, doing a class on tree identification that may have a field component and video component. So we're thinking of doing that in the spring. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and we'd love to do that. We think we'd love to do that. We're thinking about it. All the photographs here are original from the metro area. There's nothing downloaded from the internet websites or anything. So this was going to be a field class, but because of COVID, we had to do it on Zoom. So we scrambled to turn this into a Zoom program and never did more than a few trips out on the last class we did this past spring. But is really well received, and I think it's something that Audubon really appreciated doing, and the idea of the class came from Audubon for tree for birders who are out and a bird lands on a tree and they don't know what the tree is, and it would make them more conversant to understand what tree a bird landed in. So that's how it came about. It's a big component of this is like a big Sears and Roebuck catalog of trees, but we're not going to do that tonight. Going to cover mainly the concepts of the forest and basic groups of trees. We're basically living in an oak hickory pine forest, so I'm going to cover the basics of those species, and then a few more riparian or water-related trees that you're likely to encounter. So really just want you to learn to look at the forest like I look at it, and see some of the challenges that we face with our forests, both in the rural environment and the urban environment. So let's get started here. We're going to talk basically about the Shades Creek Cahaba River Watershed. We try as much as we can to include both watersheds, because Shades Creek is a major tributary, if not the major tributary of the Cahaba River. So we speak about the Shades Creek watershed and Cahaba River watershed more or less synonymously. There are a lot of ways you can see things on Shades Creek in a more accessible way that are occurring on the Cahaba River, but it's hard to get to. So it's easier to educate people about the Cahaba River really by going to Shades Creek and say walking the Greenway. So I hope we'll do a class along there and do some field trips in the spring. So here's where Cahaba River joins Shades Creek. This is an aerial photograph I took about 15 years ago, I guess. And now we have it surrounded by more or less protected land. Elton Stevens owns the private land on the right. Cahaba River Park is a big new park in Shelby County that I go to frequently to hike. And then across the Cahaba River is Living River Camp, which is 440 acres of protected property. So it's really great we have this area protected more or less in perpetuity. I was down the Cahaba this week at the old Overton Road canoe launch. I stopped there. We were hiking and I stopped there. We stopped to have some lunch with some friends. And I noticed just how much forest there is along the Cahaba River in this area. And I want to point out just how important that is for keeping the water clean. The water was amazingly clean and clear and not muddy at all. Lots of snails. So I've been intrigued by the idea that healthy watersheds are a nice balance, both aesthetic and ecological integrity. And if the area looks good, it probably is good ecologically. And if it looks bad, it probably has some ecological problems. Some of the challenges that we face in our forest are one obvious one, are invasive species. We have kudzu that actually consumes entire forests along rivers. And one of our members, Friends of Shades Creek members, asked the question, why are we planting trees like we're doing this Saturday when we can't take care of the trees that we already have? And that's a very good point. So we now try to have a exotic invasive elimination project on every cleanup and tree planting that we do. So this Saturday, we'll have loppers and pruners and saws available, and hope to have some people working on invasive species along Shades Creek while we are planting trees. Now, the Cahaba River, where Shades Creek enters, as I showed you, is really about as natural a landscape as we have in Alabama outside, say, the Sipsey Wilderness. And once that begins to be compromised, even with some design involved, it's more a naturalistic landscape, not a natural landscape. And it becomes an abstraction of nature and often not a very ecologically sound environment. So the Mountain Brook Country Club has channelized Shades Creek, and there are all kinds of issues with that process in terms of water heating, the elimination of fish species, lack of trees, and natural riparian environment that goes along with um, a natural stream, creek. Then on to more damage when you actually have equipment going in the creek. Here in Irondale, we have dredging that takes place routinely, and it totally destroys the riparian habitat along the creek. Soil is piled up along the creek, and then it washes in again with the next rain. So it's something that's done by the city just for show, basically, so that people think something is happening to keep the this flooded area that has flooded some homes in years past. Makes it look like something's being done when it's really just a counterproductive effort. They literally drive in a backhoe and clear out, dredge the creek down to the bedrock. And then, of course, we have on the right scouring from floodwaters that's increasing all the time, and then the soil erosion that goes along with that, turning the creek muddy. So all this is damaging our riparian forest and eliminating many of the really wonderful tree species that we have along Shades Creek. Up in North Alabama, I flew over Coosa River and noticed the agricultural areas are very close to the Coosa River, which becomes a source of non-point pollution entering the Coosa. Notice the very thin riparian buffer zone along the Coosa River, sometimes only one tree wide, which means that if a tree falls over, most of the tree lands outside the forest. So this is a particular problem in rural areas. And there's a debate about what constitutes a riparian forest, an effective riparian forest. And I've been in conversation with some people who are attempting to develop a statewide best management practice for riparian forests. Right now, they're just voluntary and basically based on forestry standards, but those standards don't work very well in the urban environment where there's much more intensive development. So a little bit about the theory of how forests, whether it's a riparian forest or an urban forest, declines. If you look at a circular forest and say the trees on the outside are buffer trees that protect the interior of the forest, they're the most likely ones to get lightning strikes, wind damage, soil heating, soil compaction, and protect the interior trees. And what happens during development is you open it up, allow all the negative outside influences to enter, and you basically turn everything into a what had been an interior tree into a buffer tree. It greatly increases the edge effect and reduces the area inside the forest. And ultimately, what we often end up having is a forest of one tree, where trees are planted in isolated rows, isolated from each other. And basically one tree doesn't know the next tree is there. So I've been advocating with this program I developed about 15 years ago at the Botanical Gardens, planting trees in clusters where there is mutual support and protection by the trees. Trees like the company of other trees. And actually many trees in a forest will grow this close together. They find their own way to the sky and have a mutually shared area among them that allows them all to get nutrients and water from one commonly shared area. So this works very well. These trees have thrived very nicely. If they've been planted as single trees, they probably all would have died. So here are trees in the growing season, planted a number of years ago in Homewood Park, and many of them had died simply because they are very vulnerable. They're basically each is an isolated forest of one tree. And if they do make it to maturity, they grow way over their site, have not nearly enough soil volume. And this is what we see every spring. This is along Broadway. We see these coming down every year. They come down and often do incredible damage to houses. So what we usually think of in the urban environment as adequate is really usually not. And I'd say that probably virtually everything you see in the urban environment regarding trees and soil space is probably incorrect. This is what a tree root system looks like. Have about the same biomass underground as you do above ground if you take the trunk away. And that biomass is very close to the soil surface to absorb water and air exchange. And the roots cannot grow down into the subsoil, which is very dense and usually high clay content. I think the reason people think there is a big taproot on trees is about the only thing you can pull out of the ground is a small seedling. And seedlings generally do have a taproot. It grows maybe 6 to 12 inches deep and then stops at the subsoil, and the lateral roots take over. So I've never seen a properly illustrated root system except for this one from the Morris Arboretum in Chicago. And they did this because there's such a misunderstanding of what root systems look like underground. And I think that's the reason why we have so many problems with our urban trees. Here's a tree at Red Mountain Park. Just a couple of weeks ago that I encountered along the trail, and the whole root plate was upturned. It shows you just how shallow the soil really is. And you'll see this, I'm sure we've all seen these many times. So what happens is the effect of soil saturation, water filling up the pore spaces of the soil, and then the action of wind on the top that just buoys the tree out of the ground. Here you can see the topsoil is really very thin. This organic layer is about 8 inches thick here. And then the subsoil is where all the fine particles leach out of the topsoil and accumulate below ground. You can even see some of the rocky portions of the bedrock not too far deep. So the soil is really quite shallow, and trees really need every bit of it they can get. It gets worse in the urban environment where we manage the removal of the organic matter that should be recycled to the surface of the soil and become incorporated into the topsoil. So I believe we are slowly damaging our urban soils to the point where they're going to it's going to be very hard to establish new trees. And question I ask all the time is, where are the baby trees? We see lots of big trees, but no small ones. So we put leaves out like trash for pickup, and that eliminates a lot of the recycling of both organic matter and nutrients. And leaves also play a very important role in cushioning the soil, insulating the soil from swings in temperature from hot to cold. There are a lot of benefits. Soil microflora thrive underneath leaves. And when we take that away, we eliminate all the benefits. And the forest suffers from that, and the new forest has a hard time regenerating. So most seed in the urban environment, tree seed, gets washed into the street. It dries very quickly. We're going to look at some white oaks in a minute, and they are designed to germinate immediately when they hit the ground. And if they don't reach good soil within 5 to 7 days, they just simply dry out and die. So the vast majority of trees do not regenerate at all in the urban environment. In the natural environment here at Oak Mountain State Park, you see a healthy stand of regenerating chestnut oak. These are all chestnut oaks growing, and unless the seed's eaten by a squirrel or a chipmunk or a mouse, it's going to germinate. And so we have many trees waiting in place for the opportunity for an opening in the canopy to occur, where they can then become a replacement tree. I once calculated the odds of this happening, that any one seed becomes an actual replacement tree. and it's infinitesimally small. So the amount of seed produced is amazing just for the replacement of one tree in 100 years. Much of the seed is also important for wildlife. Here, these red oak acorns become seed for chipmunks, squirrels, turkeys, migratory birds, blue jays distribute oak seed. So they're very important for wildlife. Little known fact is most acorn or oak trees have weevils that grow inside the acorns. Maybe in every third or fourth acorn will have a weevil inside, and these are native weevils that simply use the acorn to develop. The female lays an egg in the acorn just under the cap, and then the weevil bores in, eats out the inside of the acorn, and then emerges, falls into the soil where it develops over winter into an adult, and then emerges as an adult a year later. So pretty cool little known fact. And then these are supporting all kinds of wildlife, migratory birds, anything that can feast on larvae. Grant, what's Grant's last name at Stanford University calls these the hamburger of the forest. He's an entomologist, and Grant Gentry calls these the hamburger of the forest. They support a lot of wildlife. So many different types of insects feed on the oak hickory forest. I found this girdling insect at Red Mountain Park. It actually lays its egg in the cut portion of a twig and then girdles the tree so that eventually it falls off and falls to the ground, where the larvae then develop inside the twig and then emerge as an adult better part of a year later. So pretty amazing process. Tent caterpillars you've probably seen. These are at Shades Cahaba Park. Prolific and often preferentially develop on native black cherry trees. In Doug Ptolemy's book, Bringing Nature Home, he talks a lot about the host species of trees, a lot of oaks and hickories, and all the insects that they support, and then benefit migratory birds. A few shots from inside the book. And he's got a new book out, I understand, just on the oaks, and maybe some related species, but the oaks are so important for insect populations and migratory birds in turn. I believe these come from the Arboretum where you just were today, Dick. I think Michelle brought these back a year ago, some interpretive signage that she saw walking through the Arboretum. I photographed this, I believe an hornbeam leaf, maybe it's an elm along the, or maybe it's a beech. I can't tell. There's so many aphids on it that I couldn't even tell what species it was, but incredibly important for all kinds of insects that are developing usually on the underside of the leaf and twigs. And pawpaw, a common riparian species we find along Shades Creek quite frequently. There was an article in the New York Times several weeks ago about pawpaw in New England, and someone bemoaning the fact that pawpaws the fruit seemed to be going away. It's become a very popular thing to harvest the pawpaw fruit and use it for culinary purposes. And nowhere in the article was it mentioned that harvesting of the reproductive structure of the tree may be harming the regeneration of pawpaws. It was like, what's causing the loss of our pawpaws? It must be climate change. And I think it's just probably the loss of the seed, which is pretty rare to begin with. And then to harvest it removes a lot of the regeneration of pawpaws. And there was another article on forest mushrooms just about a week ago, also in the New York Times, Same story. Where are the mushrooms going that we used to harvest from the forest? Well, they're being harvested heavily for people to eat, and that has to have consequences at some point. So seed also provides food for migratory birds. Sycamore seed can be eaten by birds that prefer seed directly, not necessarily insects. Sapsuckers drill into many species to consume the rich sap in the tree. You'll often see this on many species. Pecan frequently, and apple fruit trees. They seem to like the sugary sap of the apples and pecans, and even yellow poplar often found. One way of identifying trees, we're going to sort of segue into how we identify specific trees. And Michelle took this little movie. Let me see if it'll work. Dr. Haskell, who wrote the book, The Sound of Trees, mentions in the book that we are losing much of the sound of the forest. One of the most amazing sounds I've ever heard, I've only heard it one time in my life, was standing in a beech forest on Shades Mountain at the Homewood Forest Preserve at sunset and hearing a sleet storm coming down through the many beech trees that were in the understory. Dr. Haskell says that we are smothering our sound by things like leaf blowers that just obscure the natural sound of the forest. So marcescent trees are ones that have their leaves retained throughout the winter, and you can often narrow down significantly the choices of trees if you're identifying them by the fact that they are marcescent. Let's see, we have a question. Oh yeah, sapsuckers also like the insects that are attracted to the sap, absolutely. Thank you for that, sharing that. Now, fall color, we've been looking at fall color now for a number of weeks as the light changes, days get shorter and cooler. We start to have the breakdown of chlorophyll, which happens in deciduous trees at the end of the growing season in preparation for the dormant season. So the pigments that have been there year round, the yellows and the oranges, which I believe are oil-soluble pigments, are suddenly revealed as the green goes away. And also the red pigments, which are water-soluble, are often develop in the fall. So to get a really blaze of fall color, you need the yellows and oranges and reds mixed together as the greens go away. It's just an incredible sight to see. That was winged sumac, and you can see in the forest right now, probably the next week or so, you'll see black gum, war eagle, sourwood, roll tide, red maple, blueberry, nice reds, oranges. And what I've recently discovered by the color that stood out on one of my weekly hikes is the cucumber tree, a type of magnolia that has this very muted yellow color. When the sun shines through it, it's a very translucent yellow color that I had not noticed before. And I could tell it was a magnolia tree by the bud that you see there on the twig, typical magnolia bud, and the cucumber tree is a type of magnolia, Magnolia acuminata. So our deciduous forest is turning, but also note that the pines are also losing their leaves. Pine needles last usually 2 years. And so the second year needles, now that they have been through their second growing season, are turning brown as well and dropping to the ground. leaving the 1-year-old needles to grow another year, and they will fall off a year from now. This is where the pine straw comes from in your that you buy at Lowe's for your garden. You can also see these pigments in the early spring as the chlorophyll is developing. You see the yellows gives this chartreuse color to the developing leaves, and even some reds you'll find. So you will see fall color in the spring. Another way of identifying trees is by the form. But note that an open grown form can be quite different from a form in a competitive forest where the crowns are very narrow. And remember then why it's impossible for the root system to go only as far as the width of the canopy, which many people think. They go way beyond, particularly in a forest where they commingle with other trees. So it's a big network of roots underground. And then, of course, the arrangement of leaves on the branches, the fishbone pattern of elm leaves is very characteristic of elm. The upward branching pattern of eastern red cedar and the corky twigs of some of the sweet gum trees. Most trees have cork cambium underneath, but some of it exudes out to the surface of the trunk, and is an identifying feature of many trees. Winged elm, for example, and the cork oak of Portugal is where commercial cork comes from, that is actually harvested from the trunk. Longest leaf in North America is the devil's walking stick, which is all around us, Aurelia spinosa. And this is an interesting leaf. Michelle is holding one entire leaf. That is about a 3-foot leaf she's holding, and it's doubly compound. So the leaf has leaflets that themselves are compound. So you have leaflets on a leaf. So an amazing a leaf, and full of thorns. So if you grab it, you'll only do it once. Compound leaf of hickory as they emerge. And also leaves of certain trees show clearly the upper surface and lower surface of leaves. They're two completely different functions. The top of the leaf is collecting sunlight. The bottom of the leaf is collecting gas exchange, collecting carbon dioxide to make sugars, and then releasing oxygen in the process of photosynthesis and respiration. The leaf buds, very characteristic on many species. The American beech, very long, narrow, pointed bud. The magnolias tend to have a fuzzy, whitish bud that's a giveaway. Again, it was the cucumber tree that the bud gave it away for me. I really didn't know what it was until I saw the bud on the cucumber tree, and I knew it was a magnolia, and it could only be one deciduous magnolia, the cucumber tree. Flowers in the spring are very characteristic for certain species. The apetalous flowers of willow and oaks and hickories and pines do not need petals. They're not trying to attract insects. The magnolia and blueberry flowers of the sourwood are trying to attract insects. So they do have flowers that are attractive to the insects that are pollinating. Hop hornbeam, another apetalous flower. And these work on the infinitesimally small odds that 1 grain of pollen will land on the female flower of the same species some distance away. So the solution for success is simply to produce clouds of pollen. And so don't blame the trees that produce petals for the pollen that's all over your car and your driveway in the spring. It's these that are the culprits. And you can actually see clouds of pollen blowing if you stand away on the side of, say, Red Mountain and look across Shades Valley. You'll see yellow clouds blowing of all different kinds of apetalous flowers. An example of a very showy flower on a tree is the native catalpa here in Argo, Alabama, attracting insects. And these develop into wind-distributed seed in the fall, the cigars that hang down from the catalpa tree, then release these winged seed that are distributed by wind. Called the fishing worm tree because in days past they were planted, used because a sphinx moth develops exclusively on the catalpa tree, and they would be collected as fishing bait. When people used to fish Village and Valley Creek and Black Warrior and Cahaba Rivers, they would find these preferentially to use as bait. So you'll see lots of catalpa trees growing around places in Birmingham, and that's why they were deliberately planted or left in place. So other wind-distributed seed, the alder, the winged seed of the maples, and the sweet gum ball, which actually opens when it dries and produces lots of tiny wing seed that are born on the wind. Cottonwood covers up Shades Creek every spring or early summer. Persimmon, dogwood, and hackberry, all bird distributed or animal distributed. And an intriguing method of distribution I've found is the riparian species such as walnut actually float until the pericarp or the fruit rots off, and then the seed sinks in water. Water tupelo does this. You'll find it floating, the seed floating all over Ebenezer Swamp right now. And with the action of algae over winter, the pericarp rots off and the seed sinks where it is or is distributed by floodwater, and that's where you get a new tupelo growing. Bark patterns, very characteristic of many species. American beech has characteristic lichen patterns that are really a dead giveaway for American beech. There's nothing else that looks like it, but they're colonized by all kinds of lichens. The exfoliating bark plates of sycamore, again, dead giveaway. You can identify these trees just by their bark alone. And persimmon, all these trees I usually identify just walking and looking at the bark of the trunks. Internal anatomy of the wood, very characteristic also. If you don't know what the tree is, sometimes you'll see a split tree in the forest, no leaves, and sometimes you can identify things such as black cherry that are very obvious from the color and patterns of the wood. Some trees can even be identified by diseases that they get. Black cherry typically gets a fungal disease. Hard to find a black cherry without a fungal disease, a significant fungal disease on it. The target fungus of sassafras here at Red Mountain Park, right by the trail. It's a tree you don't want to walk by in the dark, especially on Halloween night. But kind of a spooky looking faces on the trunk from this infection. Generally, the fungus will win and the tree dies, but it tolerates it for a long time. And the fusiform rust of loblolly pine, the #1 disease of loblolly pine, circles between red oak and loblolly pine and develops a gall. A great new book for identifying trees is this one from the University of Alabama Press, published in 2020. Great pictures and descriptions and really good review of the trees of Alabama. I use this book on the Audubon class and really works well. Organized by family. So want to look at one major family, probably the most important family in the forest here. And that's the beech family, which includes chestnut, beech, and oak. American chestnut, you'll see sprouting in North Alabama. I came across one at Ruffner Mountain, too, actually, several weeks ago. And digging around at the base, discovered a tag that said MS12. I suddenly realized it was planted by Marty Schulman. So these were planted hybrid American chestnuts, but they are mostly have been eliminated from the forest in the whole range, and a breeding program has been ongoing to develop a fungus-resistant American chestnut. Work is being done to insert a gene from wheat into American chestnut genome that apparently is totally immune from the fungal disease. So fungus came over on Chinese chestnuts, jumped onto American chestnut, wiped out the species basically throughout its range. American chestnut leaves, beautiful leaves. It'd be great to have these back in our forest. Here's how they looked 100 years ago. Very important nut production for wildlife. Easy to confuse with chinkapin, which is a shrub. So the sprouting trees of chestnut often look like chinkapin. And you can tell by the fruit, but you're not going to find fruit on the American chestnut. They just don't reach that stage. So the American chestnut has, I think, 3 seeds in it. Chinkapin has 1. And so you're not, unless you find a chinkapin and see that it has 1 seed, you won't know that it's not a chestnut very easily. But the book that I just showed you on Alabama trees has a beautiful illustration of the buds, and I identified the American chestnut at Ruffner Mountain by the pictures in that book. So very helpful. Another old-timey book that still is a great resource is 100 Forest Trees of Alabama. You can download this for free from the Alabama Forestry Commission. And I have used that extensively. And so the pictures I just showed you, the pages that had descriptions of trees, were from that book. So let's go from the chestnut and chinkapin to American beech, which is also in the oak family. Characteristic bud that we've seen, and characteristic lichen patterns on the bark, usually found on in moist ravines. An interesting aspect of beech are on the right, the beech drops, which is a chlorophyll lacking plant that grows in association with beech roots. So you'll often find beech drops around the root system of American beech. Interesting phenomenon where the branches have come off of the trunk. Notice how as the bark expands, it turns in from a round branch scar to an oval or teardrop shaped branch scar. Smooth bark, beautiful bark if people simply wouldn't carve their names in it. So we've gone from chestnuts, chinkapin to American beech, and now we'll go to the oaks. There are 2 basic groups of oaks, the white oaks and the red oaks. The white oaks have rounded leaf lobes. The acorns germinate in the fall. Red oaks have pointed leaf lobes and germinates in the spring. All the old wooden ships, or anywhere you need watertight wood, that comes from white oak. If you made a ship out of red oak, it would sink. So you buy a ice cream maker at the hardware store, it's going to be white oak. And here's the difference in the leaves. The red oaks have pointed leaves. The white oaks have rounded lobes. Here's a page from the book, The 100 Trees of Alabama. Notice how descriptive it is, looking at all kinds of things, the form, the bark, the twigs, the leaves, the flowers, the fruit, the winter buds, the wood, internal anatomy of the wood, the uses where you might find that wood being used, the habitat, other distinguishing characteristics, and the distribution. So these old books are really thorough in their evaluation of different species. So probably the most iconic oak species in Alabama, the white oak, beautiful, huge tree, disease resistant. You'll find it growing all over. Doug Ptolemy says it It supports hundreds. I believe I remember hearing 800 species of insects just on white oak alone, or maybe I'm thinking post oak. I can't remember, but one of those species. So extremely important. Fall germinating. Again, you'll see the taproot develops first, and then when it's deep enough, the leaves start to form. A shoot forms with leaves on it. So you think the thing is not going to do anything, then suddenly the leaves emerge from the same point as the root, and you know you've got a rapidly growing white oak. Chestnut oak is another member of the white oak group, germinates in the fall. Wavy pattern to the leaves. But you can confuse it with chinkapin oak on the right, which is a slightly more acute lobe, both in the white oak group, both fall germinating. You'll find chinkapin oak on limestone seams. So at Ruffner Mountain, as soon as you cross from sandstone to limestone, you see immediately chinkapin oak. Same at Red Mountain, and there's a seam at Avondale Park of chinkapin oaks I discovered there on a limestone seam growing right through that remnant forest up by the pavilion. So you find remnant populations of chinkapin at the limestone quarry at Ruffner Mountain, right down by the entrance to the quarry. Another white oak is overcup oak. Interesting that it's a swamp species. My theory is that the overcup lightens the acorn so that it floats. And when it drops off, it's distributed by floodwaters, and then eventually the cap rots off and you get a new overcup oak. I only know of one population in Birmingham of overcup oak. That's in Woodward Park, just behind Elmwood Cemetery. Absolutely beautiful, 90-foot trees, 4 feet in diameter, but not a single baby tree. So this park will look very different in 50 years. Unfortunately, it's a solid, almost solid overcup oak. There's some of the most beautiful trees you'll see of this species. And the city has no idea they're there. They have done nothing to protect them and nothing to regenerate them. Another very important species is post oak. You'll find these in people's yards. Very important landscape tree around Birmingham, but nobody grows it, nobody plants it. So the only ones you're going to find are natural remnants of the original forest that are still here, and most of them are well over 100 years old, and they're not going to last much longer. So I see them falling down in my neighborhood all the time. Here's what a neighbor did to their post oak. Some neighbors dug a trench. Now you know from the profile that I showed you of a root system what effect that must have had on this 100-plus-year-old post oak. And in fact, it died and had to be cut down shortly after this. I encouraged a neighbor to plant a post oak about 10 years ago, and this is how big it is today. Literally today, I took this picture. And he was, I think, cussing me for a number of years because the saying is they sleep, they creep, and then they leap. And this one crept for a long time, but now it's growing very nicely, and he's really glad to have a unique tree, a unique native tree. The only one that I know of in our neighborhood that has regenerated from the parent tree I collected nearby. Extremely rare tree. It's like a small post oak with the cross-shaped leaves, is the Boynton oak at the highest elevations of Oak Mountain Park. Also a small population in Gadsden on the sandstone outcropping right near Nakalula Falls. Extremely drought hardy tree, only reaches about 25 to 30 feet high. Here growing on the magnesium limestone at the Bibb County Glades, and then here at the highest elevation of Oak Mountain. So here you see a bicycle trail going right by it, right over the root system. So that's what happens. And looking at some of the red oaks, probably the most iconic red oak prevalent in the Birmingham area is the black oak, Quercus velutina. Very large tree, similar in size to the white oak, but the pointed leaves and the spring germinating seed. You'll see it all over George Ward Park. When George Ward Park was developed, they simply left in place the native landscape trees, the native trees, forest trees that became landscape trees. They are going away rapidly. So George Ward Park will look quite different in 50 years than it does now. Many of these trees are in very poor shape. Again, not being protected at all. No one seems to care that they go back to the origin of the park. Very large spring germinating acorns. Southern red oak, another red oak with a characteristic turkey foot pattern on the leaf, that U-shaped base. The northern red oak is an interesting tree. You'll find it only on the north-facing slopes at the base of our mountains. Characteristic white stripes to the bark, but it's falling over rapidly. My feeling, it's probably the canary in the mine of climate change, canary in the mine of climate change. I see them falling over at the Homewood Forest Preserve in great numbers, and at Oak Mountain State Park in great numbers. Here's one I took a picture of in Ontario. They get about as big here as they do in Ontario under the right growing conditions. But they just, I imagine it's a soil issue with probably root decay. So you see the continental range of northern red oak comes all the way down to Alabama, and we're about the far end. Here's one in my neighborhood, already lost its top. I've been watching this for years, and it's just falling apart. And then to its right is a post oak. Both of those trees probably well over 100 years old, and they won't last very long. The one replacement tree I see in the bottom left is a cryptomeria from Japan. Scarlet oak, beautiful small red oak tree, characteristic rings around the apex of the acorn. You see the little wavy rings around it. That is the only acorn like that. Positive identification for scarlet oak when you see those rings. Blackjack oak, high elevation, drought hardy, very thick leathery leaves, spring germinating acorns. Nobody grows it, nobody plants it. You find them all over our neighborhoods at the highest elevations. Again, they're going away rapidly. I found one 10 inches in diameter that was 110 years old out at on Oak Mountain. Here's one in Avondale Park. You see the one on the right by the swing set fell over. I collected seed from the fallen tree and grew some of the progeny. The companion tree to the left is starting to lean, and probably won't last much longer. The one on the right was like 140 years old, as I recall. Again, nothing done to protect it. The root system should have been protected. The last place you want to put a playground equipment is under an ancient tree such as this. Again, no replacement tree is available. Water oak, a dime a dozen. Everyone knows water oak. You'll find them all along our creeks and rivers where they belong, but very cosmopolitan. So they're in everybody's yard, everywhere. Huge tree, very rapid growing. This characteristic spatula-shaped leaves. The juvenile leaves look very different from the mature leaves. So when you see this multi-formed leaf on the left, that's almost always going to be a water oak, but the mature leaves turn into these spatula-shaped leaves on the right. There are several narrow-leafed oaks that are in the red oak group: the laurel oak, the willow oak. And you see these all over as good landscape trees. People love these trees because of the small leaves and the small acorns that go down storm drains very nicely. So cities love to plant willow oak, probably overplanted here at the entrance to Red Mountain Park. a really cool thing I discovered at the very highest elevation of Oak Mountain is a stand of willow oak. It's a bottomland species that grows in water. And here at the highest elevation of Oak Mountain, there's a little pocket of a little wetland area that's full of willow oaks. So the surrounding terrain in the upper right, just a few feet outside of this wetland, are some of the driest site species, blackjack oak, longleaf pine, but just down in the drainage area, which stays, it must be a geologic bowl that just stays moist. And you can even see when it drains, the soil is still moist in the upper left, right near King's Chair on the way up to King's Chair. So the fuzzy picture is you can get a guide of the different types of acorns from seed manuals. Let's look quickly at the hickory group, which the companion species for oak includes walnut and hickory and pecan. Again, the distribution mechanism of walnut, again, I'm rinsing off the tannic acid in my backyard to, I deliberately try to get them to rot quickly. And then after they've had a while, several months rotting off, it's much easier to remove the husk. Very messy job that will stain your clothes very easily. But a great riparian species. It floats, goes a long distance on floodwaters, and then distributes over the floodplain and produces a new black walnut. Lots along the Cahaba River. And then the hickories all have kind of a diamond-shaped pattern to the bark. So when you see this bark, it's almost always going to be a hickory. So here's pignut hickory, compound leaves, 5 to 7 leaflets, sometimes 9 leaflets. But again, just look for the compound leaves, those typical fruit that come down. Mockernut hickory, probably the biggest nut in the forest, the huge, bigger than golf balls that hit the ground. And then again, as the pericarp comes off, it reveals the nut inside. And that will sink. Enormous terminal buds. So dead giveaway for hickory. If you're walking around, the ones at eye level are going to have these large buds. As they emerge, multi leaflet leaves coming out in the early spring. And the shagbark hickory, a very iconic river species, tolerates a fair amount of dry site, though, if you plant it on a drier site, but typically found along creeks and streams on the floodplain. Bark peels off into sheets, and I understand that bats may use these, at least in the northern part of the state. I think the Indiana bat uses shagbark hickory as habitat. And another one, red hickory, same thing, interlacing diamond-shaped ridges. But my favorite of all is Caria aquatica, the water hickory that you find within 50 feet of a river and really nowhere else. And these are all over the Cahaba River along Shades Creek. I've seen them at Tannehill on Ropes Creek, Mud Creek. This one is at Tannehill that I'm looking up at. And I'm about 50 feet from Mud Creek. And you seldom see them further away than that. Beautiful tree with a very delicate diamond-shaped pattern to the bark. And everybody's favorite, the pecan, which is simply a thin-shelled hickory, very important food source. If you ever tried to use hickory nuts for culinary purposes, it's a lot of work to crush those thick-shelled nuts and then dig out the meat inside. My grandmother's recipes called for hickory nuts all the time. In Kentucky, we just didn't have pecan trees. But pecan is not native to the South. It has been distributed by people far and wide, east and west. So it's hard to uh, decide how far the range has gone from the Mississippi River Valley, where it's native, further out. And a colleague who graduated with me at Texas A&M has been working on the DNA analysis of pecan and try to figure out where it is naturally. I understand there's just one small population of natural pecans in Alabama over near Tuscaloosa. The rest are all apparently moved by people east and west. Apparently it started in the Yucatan Peninsula, thousands of years ago, migrated up to the Illinois area, and then migrated back down the Mississippi River Valley, and then east and west, taken by Native Americans as a food source. So now you'll find it all the way out in Texas, all the way into the Carolinas. Again, wind distributed pollen, those are the catkins. And of course, we all recognize the fruit inside. You can just break them just by crushing two of them in your hand. One more resource that you can download free from the extension system is this book, Common Trees Native to Alabama. It's a great little guide, field guide with a key. But I love the line drawings done by a friend of mine who has a degree in forestry and art from Stephen F. Austin University in Nacogdoches, Texas. And he did the illustrations for this, but has this great key inside that takes you through a decision, dichotomous key, asking, are the leaves needle-like, are they flat, are they, what do the cones look like, and different questions such as that. So you go down through it and just ask two questions each time. Whatever the answer is takes you to the next question. And it's a really great guide for sorting out the basic trees of Alabama. Probably has about 90 trees in it that you can key out pretty easily with this guide. We used it in our Audubon class and it works pretty well. So here you have bald cypress. The question is it bald cypress? Is it hemlock? It depends on the attachment of the needle to the twig. That's the question being asked here. So anyway, get down into the pines. It gives you questions about which of the four pines it might be. So I would highly recommend that. And so then let's look at the pines. The last group of trees we'll look at are the pines in the oak hickory pine forest. Here you see both the male and female flowers on pine. Again, catkins producing just pollen, and the female cones on the right, those purple cones. Shortleaf pine characteristically has these resin ducts. So when you see the pine tree that looks like it's been shot with number 6 shot all over the trunk, it's going to be a shortleaf pine. These two on the right or on the left are in Avondale Park up by the pavilion. Two straight needles contrasted to Virginia pine's two twisted needles. Slash pine in the southern part of the state, you're not going to find them around here naturally. Michelle was down there last year. This is where turpentine came from. So you'll see many of the slash pine trees scored for the draining the resin to make turpentine. Very swampy species. Contrasted to longleaf, which is a very dry site species. Here you see the grass stage of the small trees in the foreground, and they are resistant to fire up until the point where they start to bolt, and they're very susceptible to fire. And they grow as fast as they can to get big, and then they become fire resistant again. All over Oak Mountain at the highest elevations. Important food source for animals and birds. White pine, you're going to find in the northern part of the state, 5 needles per fascicle, and this characteristic white stripe on the needles. Again, you're not going to find it naturally around here at all, maybe north of Huntsville. Here's one in a yard on Broadway, as it seems to be cranking along pretty well, right near Forest Avenue on Broadway. And everybody's favorite, loblolly pine, the principal timber species in Alabama, has preempted most of longleaf pine. Longleaf now exists on only about 3% of its native range in Alabama, been preempted to a large degree by loblolly pine. Characteristic pyramidal form of the juvenile tree, and then the more open form of the mature tree. This is at Cahaba River Park. Flaky bark. Again, often you'll see fusiform rust. You can't miss the fusiform rust in a loblolly pine stand. And Virginia pine, the Christmas tree pine. If you buy a pine for Christmas in Alabama, it's going to be a Virginia pine. 2 twisted needles, lots of cones, and a thick stand at Tannehill Park. I've never seen a pure stand, probably planted, of Virginia pine. And then the Canada hemlock, also in the pine family. Very important in North Alabama for cooling streams and rivers. Being killed by the woolly adelgid that came from Asia, and it's unclear whether the species will survive. So far, and we were at the extreme southern end of the continental range of hemlock here in Birmingham, out in West Birmingham. I can't remember if it's Village or Valley Creek. There is a deep ravine of native hemlock there that has not apparently been infected by the woolly adelgid. It's come into North Alabama now, up around the Mentone area. This is what happens to it in the Smoky Mountains, completely defoliates it. The question is, will the regeneration bypass the adelgid and grow through the infestation? Don't know, that's, the jury's still out. And the cypress family, the last family under the evergreens in the Trees of Alabama book. Eastern red cedar, very typical of limestone areas. So you see this growing with chinkapin oak at Ruffner Mountain. So the decision of scale-like leaves versus needle-like leaves, that's what that means. So if you go to the key, it says scale-like leaves, this is what it means. Little, very small scales, each of those is a leaf. In pine, it would be the leaves are needles. Typical bark of the eastern red cedar. And here's the quarry at Ruffner Mountain. Lots of eastern red cedar. That's a common name cedar. It's not a true cedar. The name is hyphenated, eastern red cedar, meaning it's not a true cedar. It's a juniper, Juniperus virginiana. And I think the last species we have is bald cypress, swamp species, here at Perry Lake Park in Perry County. Upper left corner is the larch you may have heard of in the Pacific Northwest, a deciduous conifer, much like our bald cypress, but it turns a brilliant yellow, whereas our bald cypress just turns brown. But a fairly cosmopolitan species. You can plant it on drier sites and it does fine. Here's one, Eagle Scout, apparently planted at Avondale Park, but you'll see it at Perry Lake Park, surrounded by Virginia sweetspire, these little populations of Virginia sweetspire surrounding the bases of the bald cypress. And this is the tree that has the iconic knees to it. That's the formal end of the presentation. I just want to show you there are many other plant families that we can look at. Maybe I've got a few. I'll run through them real quick. Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot I included a number of them. Rusty blackhaw, which is a viburnum. You see the rusty looking petioles of the leaves, giving it its name. Sweet gum, probably the most broadly distributed species in North America. Very important, what's called a pioneer species like the pine. Wind distributed seed quickly colonizes open sites that have been disturbed. If a tornado comes through, you're going to get loblolly pine and sweet gum coming in probably before anything else. very important. And pawpaw, Asimina triloba, uh, grows in patches. Again, very seldom do you see the fruit. It's eaten immediately as soon as it ripens by squirrels. It's in the custard apple family, has delicious custard inside the fruit that is sought after by squirrels and other animals. So hard to find the seed, and this is what's being harvested in New England, and they were bemoaning the fact they're having a hard time finding it anymore. That's because the seed, as the fruits are fairly rare, and over harvesting probably has eliminated a lot of the stands of pawpaw. American holly, a riparian species, here on the Cahaba River on the right. You see the Cahaba River in the background. And a beautiful one at the Naval Academy in Annapolis I just took when I was visiting the cemeteries of some relatives. But beautiful trees along the Cahaba River. This is at Cahaba River Park, right near the main pavilion at the end of the road. Walk down to the canoe launch and you'll see a lot of American hollies. Separate male and female plants. And this is the Sipsey Wilderness. I found a bunch on the left. And here's Michelle's husband looking at the sweet birch in North Alabama. We went up to get vaccinated 2 years ago. We had to go all the way up to Winston County. So we went hiking the Sipsey, and you see the sweet birch has a characteristic roots that grow over rocks. This is a remnant of the Ice Age. It's a tree that still exists in the deep, cool ravines of North Alabama and not anywhere else in Alabama. It has a wintergreen scent to the twigs. River birch, the only other birch that I'm aware of in Alabama, native birch. Of course, you've seen the paper bark birch outside of Alabama in the upper right-hand corner, but a river species, often growing in standing water, reaches enormous size on the Cahaba River, some 3 feet in diameter. Beautiful tree, but it's the darling of every bank parking lot you come to. Somehow, many of our urban trees tolerate soils with low soil oxygen if they have been growing naturally in a wet area. They're used to low soil oxygen, so they seem to do well. So you'll see many urban trees coming from river habitats. The hornbeam tree, one of the densest woods there is, not a specific gravity greater than 1, but close to it. Very dense, very slow growing tree, this muscular type bark. You'll always see this very close to the bank of a river or creek. The companion species, almost always with hornbeam, is hop hornbeam, but always about 50 feet upslope from the hornbeam. The hornbeam stays very close to the water. The hop hornbeam will grow down to the water occasionally, but generally occupies sites above, uphill from hornbeam. So interesting couple of companion trees. And then I think the last 2 I have here are the sugarberry and the hackberry, closely related. Hackberry is going to have these corky ridges on the outside. Sugarberry is going to be smooth, but the leaves look very, well, if you look carefully, they look different, but overall, they're generally very similar species. And here's the fruit of the hackberry, important bird species. Lots of insect galls growing on the underside of the leaves, important for birds. So if we do a more extensive class, there are many more trees to explore, many more plant families to explore, but way more than we can cover tonight. So we'll see. If you're interested in doing a class, let me know, and we can do something like this one on Zoom. And we can also do a field component where we go look at things like Boynton Oak at Oak Mountain State Park, or along Shades Creek on the Greenway. So I try to accommodate everybody. regardless of mobility, can see a lot of diverse species on the sites that I picked to go to in the field. So magnolia family we haven't covered. Well, yes, we did. The cucumber tree, yeah, right there, and the big leaf magnolia. I'm sorry, I did cover that. But many more species here. Osage orange. There's one out at Red Mountain Park. It's basically a giant mulberry. And many more species, willow and poplar and elm, all important river species. We'll have a tree planting this Saturday on Shades Creek. Come on out if you'd like to. We're going to meet at the parking lot, gravel path down to the greenway. Dick, you're exempt from this, but anyone else, please come. We have a great time. We planted, like I said, probably 1,000 trees at this point along Shades Creek over the years. Great turnout by high school and college students. And we've had great success over the years. These are a number of years ago, probably 5 years ago, I took these. So many of these are quite larger than this now. Just trying to increase the diversity of trees along Shades Creek. We planted some of the hottest, driest sites around parking lots and done quite well with enough mulch. These little trees that you see being planted here are now probably an average of 8 to 10 feet tall. They've done very well. Here are the usual suspects. I see Hans, I see Neil, Jane's husband, and Betsy Dobbins, and a forestry friend of mine. So we had to do this twice. We did it once and the city cut it down, and we came back the following year and planted it again and made sure they were well marked, and they have survived. So that's the key to that. So here's some of the first ones we planted. These are now probably 12 feet tall, 15 feet tall in some cases. These are the very first year we did this, probably 12 years ago, I'm guessing. And the quote from one of the students of the class about how diverse trees are amazing in terms of the types of seed that they have and the types of distribution by wind and animals. And it is pretty amazing. This is the largest yellow poplar in Alabama, up in the Mississippi Wilderness. We hiked into it after we were vaccinated 2 years ago. We needed something to do, so we hiked into the biggest yellow poplar there is. You come to one yellow poplar and you go, is this it? And let's go look a little further. And we go a little further, and there's a bigger one. You go, I wonder if this is it. When you come to this one, you know you've reached it. It's a huge yellow poplar. And of course, in contrast, the bristlecone pine out in Colorado, some are getting to be 5,000 years old. Just amazing trees. So the contrast of moist habitat to dry habitat is pretty striking. I think that's my last slide. Yeah, that's it. So thank you all for your attention. And let me know if you're interested in doing a more thorough class in trees.
Henry, thank you very much. That was very interesting. We really appreciate your contributions. If you've got just a minute, if there's anyone that wants to either raise a hand or just I'll call on you, or you can jump in and ask a question. We'll do a round robin for just a couple of minutes.
I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, James.
The wax that's on the magnolia leaves on the top surface, is that frequent? The trees will have wax on the leaves, and what's the purpose? I would think it would shed water, and they would want to have water.
That's correct. It's called epicuticular wax, and it basically.
Yeah, I saw the name, but
pardon?
I saw the name you have, but I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, it's a waxy coating that seals off the upper part of the leaf. The upper leaf doesn't like to lose water. The water, moisture, and gas exchange takes place on the underside of the leaf. That's why the top side of the leaf and the bottom side of the leaf look so different. So the top is basically a solar panel that would be interesting to Paul, I think. And then the bottom is full of tiny microscopic holes. So the bottom of a leaf has hundreds of thousands of holes in it that are responsible for gas exchange. And there's this phenomenon called the paradox of pores, where water is translocated more efficiently outside of a heavily porous surface than an open surface. It has to do with the pressure at the leaf surface over each pore that allows water, vapor, and gas to exit the pores more easily than if it were not pores. So kind of counterintuitive, but so they're very efficient at removing water. So trees are extremely efficient at removing moisture from the ground if you need to dry an area out. And often trees are cut down and then left and the site stays moist. Did you have
So
another question?
another question. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
another question. The color in the fall, some years people will say, oh, you know, the colors were really not good this year. They're mostly browns. And other years they'll just be spectacular coloration as the
Yeah.
leaves change. So is there a reason for the difference, or are we just perceiving it differently?
No, there's a reason. It has to do with the balance between dry, followed by wet, followed by cold temperatures,
Ah,
along with the shortening day length. So you can probably look it up online. It's pretty complicated physiology. And I used to do a class on fall color years ago, and I have to bone up on it every year and really study it. But it's been found now that the pigments actually absorb other wavelengths of light that chlorophyll does not, and then shunts the energy over within the leaf so that it's actually capturing more wavelengths of light. But there are different theories on why the colors exist. A professor asked me when I was an undergraduate, a chemistry professor, so why do you think plants might be more complicated physiologically than animals? And I didn't really know. And he said, well, because they don't move. And the plant has to do everything it needs right in one place for 100 years. And then the follow-up question was, why might it just appear that plants are more complicated than animals? Again, I didn't know. And he said, well, because if you look at most university research, there's probably 1% research done on plants compared to animals. Because we're animals, we study animals more, and we may just not know enough about them. And so they seem more mysterious than they really are. So whether they really are more complicated physiologically or they just appear to be, I'm not sure that's been answered yet. But it is complicated physiology, at least to me. And it has to do with the combination of the temperature, dropping temperature. One theory about the development of reds is that they attach to sugars in the leaf. And so if you have a drought followed by a wet period, it solubilizes the sugar in the leaf more quickly, attaches to the anthocyanins, or they attach to the sugars, and you get more reds. Whether that's total nonsense, I don't know. There are different theories I've read over the years of why you'll get more intense colors certain years. So certainly the development of the reds in the fall in combination with the carotenes and anthocyanins, the oranges and yellows that are already there when the chlorophyll disintegrates, with the addition of reds under the right circumstance, you can have a very brilliant fall color because of that, just depending on the balance of colors in the leaf. And again, that's based on temperature and day length and moisture. That's about the best I can describe it, James. I'm sorry. There was something on
No,
NPR.
that's good.
Um,
That's good.
they did something in the evening on All Things Considered. You may have heard it. Maybe it was so overly simplified, I was embarrassed that they actually did it on the air. But I could have done probably better than that. But anyway, it was still, if you really delve into it, it's quite complicated. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all very much for your attention. Appreciate it very much. And let me know if you're interested in doing a tree class, and we may do that through Friends of Shades Creek, both online and in the field. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Henry, very much. Appreciate it.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Awesome.